The idea would be that over roughly the last 2,500 years, philosophers have had nothing better to do than to try and produce systematic accounts, not of how people do behave, but how they ought to behave. And claims about how people ought to behave, that's a normative claim, what we ought to do. Very often that's situated within a kind of moral theory. And a theory is going to justify the kinds of decisions that you make. So let's go back to Aristotle, nearly 2,500 years ago. So Aristotle had this account of what it is to be moral that's very much based upon ideas about human flourishing that then is exemplified by the kind of character that you have. And there's a whole account to do with moral psychology based upon various virtues and vices. So the good person knows how to act in the right way. And that's partly through training, through habituation within a particular society. But it's a vision of being an individual, of being a moral character, taking responsibility for your actions, but that is shaped within the kind of social environment that you have. Other kinds of moral theories that you might have heard about are things like consequentialism, ideas about focusing on outcomes, on consequences. And very often you'll see public health practitioners as described as being crude consequentialists or utilitarians. Utilitarianism is a version of consequentialism. So what that means is that the accusation is all you care about are the outcomes. You don't care about how you actually arrive at those outcomes. And then there's another moral theoretical tradition called deontology that is concerned about duties, about how you act as an individual and, again, taking responsibility for your actions. And there are many, many other kind of theories. It all gets very complicated and so on. But it's basically an attempt to produce a systematic account of what you ought to do. And the idea is that the theory is something that you can discuss outside of this kind of context. It's almost that you can have a separate discussion, many people think, about what the correct moral theory is without being particularly interested in the real world. And I personally would argue that's incorrect, that what you really want, if you want a moral theory at all, is one that's actually going to help you. It's going to have some impact in the real world. Okay, so the thought is that we could talk about moral theory, but eventually I persuaded my colleagues after about 10 years of discussion to change the master's course that we had. So we started off day one of a new master's course with all these students who had never been exposed to ethics before and just went through all the moral theories. And it's a way to put everybody off actually seeing the relevance of ethics. So what I prefer to do is to think a little bit more closer to actual decision making. And one way to do that is to have a discussion about framework.